When did good intentions make something worse? Story 1. No Child Left Behind and its replacement Every Student Succeeds Act. America has never really had good public education, but it used to be serviceable. No Child Left Behind came in to try and create some milestones and accountability. Instead, it made the problem worse. Every Child Succeeds Act came in and tried to address its problems, but changed the stuff that wasn't the problem and left the bad parts unscathed. Taken all together, 57% of high school graduates can't read at a 7th grade reading level, and over a quarter are functionally illiterate. America is kind of scary. It's so big, and a lot of its people are so dumb, and I'm one of them. Story 2. Trying to help a really drunk person. I'm a talkative woman, and I started talking to another woman at a bar who was really drunk. She told me her friends deserted her, so I said she could hang out with me and my friends, as it was my birthday. I wanted to keep an eye on her, plus she seemed fun. Then she started falling off of chairs and spilling drinks, so I encouraged her to get a cab. She started crying how everyone hates her as I was helping her outside, but she agreed to go home. I got a cab, paid for it because she was a mess, then all of a sudden she got really violent and ended up kicking me in the face trying to get out of the cab because she wasn't done. She pushed me and told me to F off, but she sat back down in the cab crying. We had already exchanged numbers, so the next day she texted me apologizing profusely and asking if we could stay friends. I told her I appreciated her apology, but no thanks. I will always try to help people where I can, but that turned me off from going above and beyond. I have no idea how people can act like this when they're drunk. When I'm that drunk, I just get friendly and embarrass myself trying to be friends with everyone. I've never been so drunk that I felt the need to attack someone. Mean drunks are just people that are secretly mean sober. Story 3. During one of China's extreme dry seasons, like their Dust Bowl period, Mao ordered the killing of birds to prevent birds from eating seeds and increase agricultural productivity. Instead, what happened was the birds that feed on plants' pests were killed, making the situation even worse, and resulting in the death of millions. A bad dry season, deforestation, misuse of pesticides, and a war against nature under his belief that conquering nature was the only way to improve agricultural yield and the well-being of their citizens. Stupid, uninformed decisions, even if seemingly rational, resulting in one of the biggest human and ecological disasters. They were so desperate to get out of extreme poverty and wanted to modernize fast. Unfortunately, the people who spearheaded this movement were so uneducated and prideful that they made one bad decision after another, which led millions to their deaths, followed by drones of brainwashed people who carried out their orders. It makes me sad to think about all the human suffering and death this caused. My mom remembers what it was like when she had to visit the mainland from Hong Kong as a child. Whenever she visited, she and her siblings had to haul an enormous amount of things, food, cooking oil, clothing, etc. from home, to give to her relatives in the mainland because they didn't have any. They couldn't buy any because there wasn't any available. She remembers vividly the time when she ate an apple to its core, then her mainland cousin grabbed it from her and ate the core, so it wouldn't be wasted. Story 4. Plastic bags. Back in the late 90s, there was a huge push for people to stop using paper grocery bags because of the amount of trees being cut down for paper. Unfortunately, it turns out the logging industry can be pretty sustainable, as long as they actually care, and plastic bags are not recyclable and so thin that reuse is uncommon. Instead, they're contributing to massive amounts of plastic pollution in the environment. Another example is the protest against hunting white-tailed deer. Unfortunately, we didn't think about that before we killed their natural predators, and hunting is an effective way of keeping their population at sustainable levels. I don't understand how the obvious answer wasn't to plant more trees, but invent something new that's even worse in the long run. That's an idea that only a rich person could offer up. Just throw money at it with no idea how to truly solve the issue. Story 5. The opioid crisis. Initially, it was highly restricted and doctors hated prescribing opioids because they knew how addictive they could be. Well, here we are. I started getting severe thoracic back pain in 2017. So right around the time the opioid epidemic became the major news headline, my pain was so bad that I literally could not sit or lie down, so no sleeping. It was the most miserable experience I have ever been through, and it lasted for months. I went to my primary and 2 other ortho doctors pleading my case, but none would prescribe me painkillers. I don't think I've ever been so infuriated. I resorted to buying a ton of pot and just getting so high that it became somewhat possible to sleep a little bit, but I hate smoking. I get horrible anxiety from it, and 1 Vicodin in a night would have solved my sleep issue. I know this because I got so desperate that I ended up buying 2 Vicodin from a dealer, and they were a godsend. Ironically, I was, without asking, prescribed 30 Percocet with a refill for getting a completely pain-free concussion in 2012, and a prescription for 30 Vicodin with a refill, also without asking, around 2015 when I went to an urgent care with a migraine migraine. It's kind of crazy how much medical attention has changed in just a handful of years. Story 6. My parents thought that if they brought us kids to church every week, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and all day Sunday, had us go to private religious schools and made us volunteer for religious organizations, we'd stay out of trouble and be as zealous as they were. As soon as each of us could, we ran away and never looked back. One of my sisters won't even attend a funeral if it's in a church. Story 7. Purity culture and the I kissed dating goodbye movement. It was a response to hookup culture and the free love movement of the 60s and 70s, and all of its downsides and dangers. But it left people with no idea how to have healthy relationships, sexual dysfunction, and worse, not to mention an increase in STIs and teen pregnancy, as they never learned how to protect themselves and mitigate risks. I grew up in a church and read the I Kissed Dating Goodbye book. I remember young people would rush and marry the first person who would have them because they wanted to be able to be physical, but didn't want to face eternal damnation. Then they end up divorced 2 years later because they married the wrong person. And since most people won't be in a relationship with you if you won't do it with them, it led to a tiny limited dating pool of just people from your church. We'd go years without a single date, praying God would send us a godly man who would be willing to wait. Story 8. Balloon Fest of '86. They released 1.5 million balloons in Cleveland for a world record and ended up blocking the Coast Guard in the rescue of 2 fishermen who died because they didn't get to them in time. It shut down the airport, highways, and it caused traffic accidents. Bulldozers had to be used to clear the way. It was all for charity. People still find balloon remnants in the water. I'm dying to know, what on earth did they expect to happen with all those balloons? Were they supposed to float up into space? Story 9. My neighbor, who is supposedly getting evicted soon. Basically, she saw young drug addicts as people so that she could change for the better. She'd find them somewhere and bring them home. Evidently, the idea was that she would show them a warm apartment and good food and they would realize the error of their ways and change for the better. That, or a safe place to do their drugs. We had a door code so they would come in and knock on her door until she answered. It was a constant stream of strange people going in and out of her apartment all night long. I figured it wasn't my problem. People can do whatever they want if they aren't hurting anyone else. But then, 3 of the men decided to take advantage of her because it's not like she could physically kick them out herself, and she wouldn't call the police. These are people who don't want to change. They like their lifestyle, and she gave them an upgrade. We're pretty sure we know what they're doing in there. They come back at 1:30 a.m. and either snort something or smoke something that from the hallway smells like cat pee or paint thinner. Then they scream bloody murder, throw things, and have domestics until 11 a.m. Like clockwork. Police can't actively go into the room, and even people on the top floor are calling them. Landlord and management are doing their best to get them out, but that's a lengthy process. They disabled the door code, but they are still getting in. Even the girl has taken to the hospital for overdosing a few times. Threats are common. Anything not nailed down in the gym and lobby are getting trashed and stolen. The lobby bathroom is trashed constantly. Cars in the parking lot are being broken into and parts are being stolen. These men stalk around the parking lot watching people. We do have visitor rules which are being broken. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Everyone expects to hear bullets flying any time now. My goodwill is gone. We want her out. Story 10. A man named Dr. Spock wrote a handbook on child rearing. It was widely circulated and well received. Many of our parents likely got advice from this book. In it, he recognized that babies threw up a lot, and therefore recommended newborns be laid on their stomachs to sleep. Unknowingly, this would result in the accidental smothering deaths of thousands of newborns. A huge number of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, cases can be laid at his feet. To this day, the Back to Sleep campaign is still fighting to update parents on what we now know newborns should sleep on their backs until they can reliably roll over for themselves. Story 11. The DARE program. They really messed up by overhyping the dangers of pot. Like if you smoke it once, you will die. They thought it would make kids avoid all drugs by comparing it to harder drugs, but all it did was make kids take the harder drugs less seriously. I know a few people who tried pot after DARE and they felt very lied to. It wasn't that bad, so they tried harder stuff because they now had doubts about how bad it actually was. This is exactly how it went for me. In high school, I was super straight edge. Then in college, I started hanging out with people who smoked and did other things. I already knew drug use was more common than DARE let on, but now I was learning from first-hand experience that the whole using drugs once will kill you narrative was a total lie. There are drugs that can kill the first time, but conveniently Dare doesn't talk about those ones. From there, I was like, I guess everything they taught us was a lie, so I might as well figure out what's true for myself. Thus began a college experience of using hard drugs to self-medicate my mental health issues, humiliating myself while I was under the influence, and failing to even get cum laude because I was prioritizing drugs over my education. I eventually got clean, and now I barely even drink anymore, but getting there was hard, a miserable road that left me with a host of regrets and a severe lack of self-respect. So yeah, the whole lie to scare 'em straight thing might have worked for some, but it made things a whole lot worse for me. Story 12. I remember hearing that the person behind the like function of Facebook legitimately just saw it as a nice way for people to show others what they like, or a way to positively react to things. It turned out to have a huge negative impact on social cognition, such as teenagers developing depression. Story 13. A company in a town I used to live in employed a lot of people from the local disability support center. These people had mental disabilities such as Down syndrome, and this company employed them to come in for a few hours a week and work. And by work, I mean little tasks that gave these employees' lives a sense of purpose and structure. Things like folding pamphlets and stamping papers, and they would be paid a small amount for their time. Not minimum wage, but enough for them to be thrilled with their pay from working. The government made some changes so that these people had to be paid minimum wage, I assume to avoid people being taken advantage of. I'm sure that they had the best intentions in doing this, but this company and many others couldn't afford to pay all of these people minimum wage, so they had to cut back to only letting 1 or 2 people work instead of all the people who were working for them initially. It was really sad, especially because these people didn't understand why they weren't allowed to work anymore. My aunt is severely mentally disabled, and she works at a factory that specifically employs disabled people, and she absolutely loves her job. She does a few different things. She once told me about how they had her making envelopes or something, and I thought she was going to complain about how boring the work was, but instead she was just gushing about how nice everyone was and how much she loves her work friends. Then asked me if I liked the necklaces, tea bags, and word search books she bought with her own money. I don't know how much she gets paid, but recently my family was at a work ceremony for her, and she won an award for being the hardest worker, and the look on her face was priceless. I don't even want to think about how she would cope if she lost her job. Not being able to go to work with COVID was hard enough for her. Story 14. Those parents who solve all of their kids' issues and don't make them stress about the consequences of their own actions. Their kids just turn into inept and entitled adults who still act 15 for decades, and not only have a harder life for themselves, but make life miserable for everyone around them too. Obviously, it's also bad to go too far the other way. Raising a child is a balancing act. Story 15. My uncle took me and my brother in because he wanted us to get a good education. My mom and dad agreed, since they knew that my uncle would be able to give us a better shot at making something of ourselves. My uncle's intentions were good. However, my uncle's wife made our lives a nightmare. She mistreated us, and my uncle was unable to do anything about it. His inaction made him complicit. Even through the hardships, my brother and I still managed to get an education, but my uncle's reputation was affected negatively. Family members don't see him the same way, and his wife is really disliked, to put it mildly. It started with good intentions, but it didn't end well for my uncle. In conclusion, I want to say that what my brother and I went through as teenagers shaped us. My uncle's wife may have believed she was inflicting pain, but in retrospect, she was unknowingly instilling resilience in us. Sometimes when you think you're hurting people, you're inadvertently teaching them the skills that will contribute to their success. What we went through definitely contributed to our success at different stages of our lives. In university, it gave us the motivation to work hard and excel as we knew it was the key to financial independence and freedom from family influence, including from my uncle and his wife. As adults, it has helped us handle the challenges of work and business and achieve success. Additionally, it has taught us about the kind of women we really don't want to associate ourselves with. I will never be with a woman who mistreats my family. It's not even an option, nor is it negotiable. Please like and subscribe if you've made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the video, and have a wonderful day. Story 16. Classifying smart kids with high-functioning autism as gifted and putting them in separate or older kid classes where they don't really learn to socialize, while crushing their childhoods with academic responsibilities and telling them they're special. They probably thought they were going to create a generation of rocket scientists, and I'm sure there are a few, but mostly it just resulted in people totally unprepared for adulthood with severe self-esteem issues. Story 17. A lot of old programs centered around weight and eating disorders just led kids to being more conscious about being being judged because of their weight, despite the intentions of wanting to prevent bullying and promote healthy weights. It didn't even matter if it was anti-anorexia or wanting to decrease obesity. In my school, they showed us pro-anorexia sites with a beware message, but I couldn't help thinking that this talk was the only reason I knew they existed. 90s teen here. From when magazines ruled the world, many teen girl magazines had articles that talked about people who overcame eating disorders. I remember looking at those celebrities and aspiring to have that eating disorder. Those articles planted seeds in me for having an on and off eating disorder. My biggest accomplishments as a teen were going the entire day eating only a Nutri-Grain bar and water. I still have an incredibly unhealthy relationship with food and my body. Story 18. Sheltering your kid from every possible problem. The whole stranger danger thing did a number on the American psyche. Never letting your kids out of the house unsupervised for fear of the unbelievably small chance of a random stranger kidnapping them has had far-reaching negative consequences for generations. For years, in all weather, I walk our dog around the block in front of our house. There are so many dog walkers in the neighborhood it's crazy sometimes. At one house, the parents would be out on the porch and their 4 or 5-year-old son would be playing in the driveway and would ask me questions about my little dog, who had always chose the telephone pole in front of their driveway to pee on. More than once, the mother came flying off the porch, screaming for the kid to get back in the house. I mean, there wasn't a vehicle anywhere in sight that I could have used to abduct him. It was just me, an unforgivably basic middle-aged woman in knee-length shorts, a t-shirt and flip-flops, with a little fluffy dog on a leash. A day after one of the mom's freakouts, the kid approaches my dog and I and turns to his parents and yells, "Is this the lady you said was scary and I shouldn't talk to?" I just looked at them and laughed, but I noticed that they literally never sat out on the porch again and the kid was never in front of their house again. What kind of damage does that do to a kid? Story 19. Once upon a time, I found a wallet on the beach. Having lost my own more than once and not having it returned to me, I am aware that it is a stressful life event, so my first thought was how to return it quickly. Looking through the contents, the owner was from out of state, and there was no contact information other than the driver's license. Aside from that, only a few credit cards and some cash. Not knowing how long ago the owner had left, I thought, let's just sit here for a while and maybe he will return looking for it, since that's the first thing that I would do. After a couple of hours of fun and sun, we needed to move on. My next best idea was to turn it into the local police station, which we found easily enough just down the street. What I thought would be a quick in and out turned into a full-on interrogation session, during which I was at one point accused of theft or robbery. It was a bizarre experience to say the least, which wasted an hour of our day. Story 20. Somali piracy. It all started because white-collar criminals from Europe were illegally dumping toxic waste in the water near Somalian fishing waters because it was cheaper to do that than dispose of it properly. This not only killed the fish those villages needed to survive, but also resulted in miscarriages, stillbirths, and birth defects. Eventually, a bunch of the fishermen decided they'd had enough, and knowing that no one else was going to protect them, motored out to the dumping boats and took the crew hostage, demanding reparations. Thing is, they made a lot of money from that. Like crazy money. Word of that started to get around, and a lot of men fighting in the militias against petty warlords decided to desert and start their own pirate crews to make bank. Suddenly, the pirates weren't just fishermen going after criminals. Now they were greedy mercenaries going after any boats unlucky enough to enter their territory. The irony, however, comes when white-collar criminals in Europe, sound familiar, realized that by dropping a few $1,000 to set up a crew with a boat and some rifles, they could stand to make millions back. Sponsoring pirates was an amazing investment in terms of return. Soon most pirate crews were picking their targets based on intel provided to them by European sponsors. I just think it's a wicked sort of irony that the whole thing started as a counter to white-collar criminals, and then it ended up being sponsored by them. Story 21. Haiti did not have cholera. A disastrous earthquake hit Haiti in 2010. After the earthquake, humanitarian forces from the UN arrived to help, and the Nepalese contingent introduced cholera to Haiti. This epidemic has since infected approximately 800,000 people and killed over 9,000. Cholera arrived in Haiti in October of 2010, soon after the arrival of a new contingent of United Nations peacekeepers from the cholera-infected region. The scientific evidence now points overwhelmingly to the responsibility of the peacekeeping mission as the source of the outbreak. 9,145 people have died so far, and almost 780,000 have been infected. Story 22. My dad worked for a huge billboard company and they made billboards out of large vinyl tarps. Well, one day, someone had this great idea to slit up the old used billboard and donate them to a third world country to use as tents and save the environment. It sounded good till some tsunami or other storm washed thousands out to sea. But what happened was the camera team zoomed in and there was a Coca-Cola logo on the tarp washing right out to the ocean with loads of people. Coca-Cola was not happy about the negative press and they stopped doing that program. Story 23. Bounties for killing invasive animals. You have a bunch of animals you don't want, so you pay people for each animal they kill, usually by getting them to produce the carcass or a unique body part. People then start breeding said animal, as it's easier and more lucrative than catching them in the wild. The authorities find out and stop the bounty program, so the breeder let all of their newly bred invasive animals into the wild. The situation is now worse than before. There's a famous example involving cobras in India, if I recall correctly. They also tried this with rabbits in the area I used to live in as a kid. In this case, no breeding was required as the bounty drop-off point was the local police station. You'd go in with a bag of cute bunny tails. The officer on duty would count the tails and pay you for each tail. He'd then take the bag of tails around the back of the station and throw them in the dumpster, at which point a friend of the bounty hunter would dive into the dumpster, retrieve the tails, go into the police station by the front door, and repeat the cycle, with just the retrieved set of tails. Story 24. The unexpected consequences of your donations. Tom's is a company that pledged to donate a pair of shoes to a child in need for every pair purchased. Turns out that the company's donations disrupted local shoe markets in developing countries, putting local shoemakers out of business, thus creating a dependency on foreign donations. Additionally, the shoes donated by Tom's were not always appropriate for the local climate or culture, and were not always of the same quality as the shoes being sold. Reportedly, they have ended up in landfills. When I took a trip to Kenya in the late 2000s, Toms were a huge deal. I bought some for the trip, thinking if they make these for the people there, they must work well in that climate. Wrong. Their soles are useless. The thorns and prickles in the grass went straight through them. Never bought another pair. Story 25. Okay, hear me out. The US emancipating slaves overnight. Ending slavery the way we did wasn't right. Imagine thousands and thousands of adult men and women, as well as their children who are illiterate and uneducated. They know how to do servile work only. For the adults, they've never been able to really make a decision on their own that has a major impact on their lives. And one day, that system is dissolved. If they stay enslaved states, what work can they possibly get? The same thing they are doing most likely, albeit now they have to be paid to do it. In truth, many former slaves did indeed just stick with what they knew for pay, which wasn't exactly great. Some former slaves did have good relationships with their enslavers, and figured it was best to just stay put. Alternatively, their options were to go to states that didn't have slavery before the Civil War. Well, as it turned out, the white populations of Union states weren't exactly thrilled to have former slaves flooding the job market and trying to live with them. The largest race riot in United States history, the NYC Draft Massacre, took place just months after the Emancipation Proclamation was made. 120 men were killed as a result. In fact, even prior to emancipation, the Underground Railroad had its terminus in Canada, partly because whites in free states didn't want former slaves around. But what is an uneducated, illiterate, and unskilled former slave to do in the North? Not much but be exploited for cheap labor during the Industrial Revolution and be forced into literal ghettos. Much of today's problems experienced by American black people are the direct result of the government taking zero meaningful steps whatsoever to prepare newly freed men for equality. The ironic thing is that in the South, while slavery was still an institution, some whites were teaching them to read and write because they understood that the institution of slavery wouldn't last forever with the industrialization of the country and new inventions to make agriculture less dependent on human beings doing physical labor. So yeah, of course ending slavery was the right thing to do. The way in which it was ended only granted freedom from slavery, but did nothing to ensure freed men would have the means to survive and thrive. Story 26. Harry Frederick Harlow wanted to prove that humans cannot survive without love and affection. He needed an animal that was sufficiently human-like, and he settled on monkeys. His research went in a really dark direction. Harlow wanted to prove the importance of early social interaction and social development, and the importance of family and love, but his cruel methods ended up causing some of the monkeys to engage in self-mutilation or starve themselves to death. He raised the monkeys from birth with as little love and affection as possible, in isolation chambers for up to 24 months. months. They became empty shells of living animals. He didn't have good intentions. Even a lot of the scientists in his field at the time said his experiments were pointless, and they already had data on what he was testing. He even went on to try and continue his work. The guy was just a psycho, and not much of worth came out of anything he did. Story 27. The introduction of non-native species as a means of solving an environmental problem. In Hawaii, it's the bane of our existence. Invasive species go all the way back to Polynesians. They brought pigs and chickens for food. They cause all sorts of problems now that they are wild. We also have mongoose. Rats were decimating the local bird population by eating their eggs, so the government released mongoose to handle the problem. However, rats are nocturnal and mongoose are not. So instead of going after the rats, they went after the birds. Then there's the cats, brought as pets. Now they are an ecological menace. They love eating the local birds. See a pattern? Story 28. My mom called my Christian university that my parents forced 17-year-old me to attend to inform the school that I was smoking, drinking, and having sex. She assumed that because it was a Christian university, they would put me into a counseling program to get me back on track. She was wrong. The school told me to pack my bags, leave immediately, and they rescinded the 80% scholarship I obtained, causing me to owe the full 100% for that semester, which I'm still paying off a decade later. Story 29. The invention of social media. When Friendster was started, I genuinely believed they wanted to build something that allowed people to socialize and communicate in a new and modern way. On paper, early MySpace is a brilliant concept that made a lot of people realize the potential of the internet. These concepts were then mutilated and turned into what social media is today, quite possibly the single most socially damaging invention that ever happened. Far away from bringing people closer together, it has turned into a tool that is tearing people further apart, making them feel more disconnected with society than ever. And instead of democratizing discussion, it has put even more power into the hands of the elite. Thanks for watching until the end. Please leave your story in the comments. I would also love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.